Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the supportive viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield, where a gift from a friend about 3 years ago turned into what you see here now, a civil rights museum. We're in the Springfield home of Aaron Pearl, and Aaron's a middle-aged guy from Springfield.
Yes, sir.
Who is absolutely engaged in the civil rights movement, but you weren't always like that, were you? It's kind of a recent thing.
Yes, sir. What happened was I started collecting buttons, and out of buttons, I kept collecting buttons, and a good friend of mine, Clint Hanley, local guy here from Springfield, went to a show. And out of the show, he brought me a poster, and the poster was Be Victorious as He, Vote, November 8th.
Okay. With
Dr. King on there. And at first, when he gave me the poster, I was like, well, what am I gonna do with it? And I sat on it, and I said, well, hey, I need to frame this poster because this poster is history. Mm-hmm. And after I framed this poster, as you can see from my collection, it became an addiction because it just made me want to look for more and more things dealing with the civil rights movement. Yeah. And I've always wanted to preserve history because history is something that you shouldn't keep for yourself. You're supposed to keep passing it on from generation to generation. Yeah. So this poster here was the beginning of the collection that you see on the wall. Yeah. I have many other pieces that I have bought from auction houses, from other collection houses that with the pandemic, I'm still waiting on them to get into my hands where I can actually frame them. But this is just the beginning of a collection that's less than 3 years old.
It is, like you say, it's history, and it's a remarkable. It's been about 50 years now since this civil rights history began to be written. Yes. And you've got a good chunk of it, don't you? Let's look over here, because this is fascinating. This may be the most rare piece in your collection right here. This pendant from the March on Washington when Dr. King. This was I Have a Dream speech. Is that where this pendant's from? Yes, sir. And that's the original. You had to be at that event to get a pendant like this.
Yes, sir. What happened was we were in the process of purchasing the home that we're in right now. And we had already purchased it, and I had to get some painting done for the people that purchased our old home. Mm-hmm. In the process of that, the guy that painted our house, I said, hey, I showed him just my button collection and showed him this button right here, the March on Washington, which is an original piece from that March on 1963. And I said, hey, I just want to show you some of the things that I've been collecting. And he says to me, he says, I got something that'll match that. I'm like, oh, okay. Didn't think nothing else about it. I tell a good friend of mine, Clint Hanley, about it. I said, Clint, the guy says he has a pennant. I said, what do you think I should offer him? He says, whatever you do. He says, you let him make the first offer to you. Don't you just jump out there. Yeah. I said, okay. In the process, the guy calls me two days later. And he says, hey, are you still interested in this pennant? I was like, sure. I leave. My wife is upset because she's like, where are you going to? It's 9:30 at night. I can't tell her that I'm buying another piece of civil rights because all the stuff that you've seen on the wall, our old home didn't have this much space. Mm-hmm. So I had it hid underneath beds, behind dressers. And when she would start to clean, she's like, where's all this stuff coming from? So when I go to see it that night, I was like, wow. And it was glued onto a dry board. And I said, well, how am I going to be able to get this off? That whole night I couldn't go to sleep. I stayed up all night trying to figure out how I was going to be able to get it off that dry board without tearing it. In the process, I accidentally Googled a guy, and his name was Dave Borland here in Springfield. Yeah. He used to own Winchester Framing. I take it to Dave. I said, hey, Dave, what can we do? Do you think you can get off this dry board? He says, I can get it off. In the process of him taking it off, what he ends up doing, he keeps it for like several weeks. Once he gets it off the dry board, he makes the frame, and we put the button and the pennant in there. And if you notice that the frame is black and white, and that's to show the unity of the races. And from this here, not only was it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it was also the right to vote.
Well, Aaron, we were talking about that day in Washington, that I Have a Dream speech, and the day when hundreds of thousands showed up, and this is what the spirit would have felt like.
Oh yes, when you sit back and you look at it, it's people just walking for the right, marching for the right for jobs, freedom, the right to vote. And the thing is, it wasn't just a black issue. They said it was probably at the time the most people that had ever been in DC, because it spanned from the Lincoln Monument all the way to the Washington Monument. And if you've ever been in DC, that's a heck of a stretch.
Ooh, yeah.
And you had people like James Garner, Marlon Brando, Diana Carroll, Harry Belafonte, Mahalia Jackson. All these were superstars that came to attend this event. And when I think about the March on Washington, it also makes me think about Mahalia Jackson, because when Dr. King was getting ready to give the speech, he wasn't going to give it. And Mahalia told him, she was a great gospel singer. She says, no, you have to give the speech, Martin. So while he's up there, Mahalia is sitting maybe a row underneath Dr. King while he's giving the speech. Yeah. Sammy Davis Jr. is right there. Yeah. And all you can hear Mahalia Jackson saying in the background is, tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream. And that's when the speech, the great speech on the March on Washington, when he gave the speech, I have a dream. So when I sit back and I look at it, I say to myself, I said, what would my role have been as a young male would I have been able to attend this? And so it's like, taking yourself back in the time. When you come into this basement of ours, it's like the African American Museum, the new one out in DC. I'm going to take you back into time. And it's not something to make you be mad at it, but it's just to let you see how far we've come, but yet how far we still need to go.
We talked about, of course, this, but legislation had to happen.
Yes.
And legislation is still happening, and there's still things going on. LBJ, he had a lot of detractors, and he was a hero to a lot of people.
Yes.
But he got it done, didn't he?
Yes. And the thing about LBJ, and I've often said this, we talk about how great of a president John F. Kennedy was. To be honest, LBJ pushed forward when JFK was pushing, but he didn't want to ruffle the feathers of a lot of people. So if you look at the legislation that LBJ passed during his time in office, outside of civil rights, all the legislation that he passed for people in general, he would have went down as one of the greatest presidents. Yeah. Only thing that hurt LBJ was the Vietnam War. But then when you start to talk about legislation, it makes me think about even today what Al Sharpton once said. He says, we protested, we have demonstration, but after we demonstrate, we have to have legislation. And so this is showing great minds coming together in the Oval Office to hash out the passage of the Civil Rights Bill that was passed in '65. Today we're 56 years from the passage of that bill.
These fellas had a lot to do with it, didn't it? Of course, they're gathered around, look like a banquet table here, but these were, you call them the Big Six.
The Big Six. This was the Big Six of the Civil Rights Movement. You have a young John Lewis, you have a Whitney Young, you have a Philip Randolph, Dr. King, James Farmer, and Roy Wilkins. These guys came together to work together to get the Civil Rights passage, the bill passed.
Well, let's move down here because it was pretty unpleasant for a lot of folks. We mentioned John, help me out here, John Lewis. And I guess is this him here,
yes,
crossing the bridge?
Yes, sir.
Okay, tell us about that occasion.
Well, when John Lewis, just for the right to vote, we're talking 1965, for the right to vote. We knew as African Americans that in order for us to even have a chance in this world, that the power was in the word vote, V-O-T-E. We understood that. So they marched from Montgomery, Alabama to Selma, roughly 50-some miles. And they were picking people up along the way to join the march. So when they get to Selma, Alabama, and cross the bridge, the Alabama state troopers stop them and say, hey, don't go no further. Don't go no further. And they wanted them to turn back around. They gave them a 2-minute warning. John Lewis was like, in the back of his mind, I'm thinking personally, he was like, I'm not turning back around. That turned out to an event of them not turning around, for them standing up and fighting. It is often referred to as Bloody Sunday.
Here's another picture here of them coming down, and you can see the law enforcement officers are waiting for them. They've given them 2 minutes, and if they don't observe the 2 minutes, this is what's going to happen.
Yes, sir. This was also during the time period where not only were they putting dogs on African Americans, they were beating them with batons, but also hosing them down as well. And these are young students that just wanted the right to vote. These were what I would call today's game changers.
Okay, let's take a look at some of these buttons. These are, these go all over the board, don't they?
Yes, yes.
Show me some of your favorites.
Well, when you sit back and you look at it, I think of these two buttons, stand up, keep fighting, and through their eyes. And the reason why is because the buttons that I have collected, through their eyes, these people knew that it could be a better world, that we just had to fight for it. And they didn't mind. They knew that they were going to have, some people have to give up something in order to for the next generation to move forward. And for them, they gave up themselves. So when I look at these buttons, I also look at, one of my favorite buttons is the SCLC button, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And the reason why that button has so much meaning to me is because my uncle, Carl Ferris, was very active in the SCLC. He was very active in the civil rights movement. Carl Ferris became active because his first cousin was a young man by the name of Isaac Ferris. And Isaac Ferris married Dr. King's sister, Christina King. So they were very active in the civil rights movement. But then also look at the button right here. When you look at the Meredith, Mississippi March for Freedom, then I look at another button a little bit underneath it, which it says Mayor Charles Evers inauguration. Charles Evers was the younger brother of Medgar Evers, who was killed in 1963, who was very prominent and very active in the civil rights movement.
Okay, so he then became, was it the mayor of Fayette, Mississippi?
Yes,
Is that
sir.
what he became? Okay.
Yes, sir.
There's some other interesting buttons in here, and let's see, where's the one I'm looking for? Oh, stop lynching.
Yes, stop the lynching was the button that came from the NAACP, and it came out of the race riots here in Springfield, Illinois. It was where the NAACP was formed after the race riots.
The Legal Defense Fund. So they were selling buttons to raise money for a legal defense fund. Huh?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And believe it or not, this button they were selling back for 5 cents. I got a lot of 5 cents located in that button.
It didn't cost you 5 cents.
And the buttons that you're looking at, they're all original time period buttons. It's, so it was like with that, you sit back and think about it. They were raising money for legal funds because people were still getting lynched. And then directly underneath it, I look at another thing, and it comes back to what we have fought for years as African Americans, the right to vote, because voter suppression still happens even today. And the button here that you see is pay your poll tax today. In the South, as African American, you had to pay a tax and be able to pass a test in order to vote. And so to make sure that you paid your tax to be able to vote, they had these buttons just to remind the people, hey, make sure you pay your tax so you'll have the right to vote.
Now that was in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That was all swept away, isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now Bobby Rush, congressman for years, what's fascinating about this button is the fact that Barack Obama had something to do with it, didn't he?
Yes. Yes, Bobby Rush is the only candidate that ever beat Barack Obama in an election.
And it was for the Second Ward Democratic councilman, is what it was for, huh?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, things change, don't they?
Yes. And then when you look at the SNCC buttons, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating
Now,
Committee.
can you point that out for us?
Which would be these buttons here.
Oh, okay. SNCC?
SNCC.
Okay.
Those buttons, if you ever watched the movie Mississippi Burnings, where the three young men went to get African Americans registered to vote, that's what they were a part of. So once again, what's the common denominator? It was for the right to vote.
Right.
Because we understood through protesting, demonstration, we also understood that legislation was going to be the only way that we could possibly make a change in this world. Well,
Aaron, the power of the vote. You're kind of convinced that the power of the vote is where the power is, and if you can give the power or keep the power of the vote, then you can change. You can make changes, but without it, you can't change anything. And this young man we're looking at over here has a lot in common with this young man here that's, and this is considerably later, maybe 2 generations later.
Yes, the picture over there was the young man in 65. This is a young man in 2021, roughly 56 years after that picture was taken, and we're still fighting for the same thing. And then if you look at his picture, the guy over there had vote on his forehead. This young man is holding a sign saying, future voter. And we understand that that when we're dealing with votes, that sometimes the vote is suppressed. And we know that it was trying to be suppressed in Georgia. It was suppressed with Stacey Abrams, who could have went ahead and ran for any other office and became an elected official. But Stacey Abrams was a game changer and a visionary. And she put a plan together to turn the state of Georgia blue, which was a red state. So when you sit back and you look at it, young people holding up signs, because we do know that the youth are the future, but we also know that there are a lot more youth than there are adults. And if you can get them out to vote, they can become a changer. Because by getting them out to vote in Georgia, where this picture was taken at, they were able to turn the state back to blue, and a young man named Raphael Warnock became a senator in Georgia.
Yep. Okay. This man was named Cassius Clay at one time.
Yes.
When he was an Olympic boxer, and I think even maybe part of his pro career. Changed things around, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
He suffered for it too, didn't he?
Yes, he did. In order to make change, you have to give up some things. And I think about this picture here when I look at it. Cassius Clay is a young man, probably 20, 21, 22 years old. For a boxer, you don't get to box that long because too many left hooks and jabs kind of wears you down. But he decided not to go to Vietnam because, like he said, he didn't believe in the Vietnam War. But before the Vietnam War, he was also a big advocate for the civil rights movement. So in this picture here, how I put it in the frame is, you notice in 64, he's Cassius Clay. He was banned for boxing, not only because he was very active and outspoken about the civil rights movement, because he didn't care for the treatments of African Americans during that time period, but he refused to go fight in the Vietnam War.
Right.
So he comes back 6 years later in 1970, not as Muhammad Ali, not as Cassius Clay, but he comes back as Muhammad Ali.
Yep. And actually, still had a good hand in changing the world. He's
Yes,
a very effective person. There's a really neat old poster right there of him, right there. And over right here it is in 1968, Life magazine. Frederick Douglass, of course, had been dead for a long time.
Yes.
But this just goes to show how influential he was during his life. He was, of course, alive during the Civil War. And still, even then, in 1968, he's still considered very influential. Now, okay, the whole idea of slavery, a lot of people, of course, wouldn't believe some of these photographs that you have on the wall. The slave auctions and the places in town where they held slave auctions in the South. This one is a very disturbing image right here, and this was on Life magazine in 1956. People alive probably were not even aware that had gone on.
Yes. When you look at that picture, it's just amazing because Life magazine during that time period was a prominent magazine.
Oh yeah.
And it wasn't a prominent magazine for African American people. This was actually a white magazine. So for what you're seeing to make the cover on Life magazine, somebody on Life magazine noticed that, hey, first history needed to be told, and there needed to be some changes so we do not go back into fall back into what we fell back into.
Here's a good picture from, I guess this is just before the Civil War, but this is out of Atlanta, is that right?
Yes, sir, Atlanta, Georgia.
Yeah, and look at the sign, auction and Negro sales.
Yes. And what's amazing when you look at it, it had to be like a mom and pop's type store. And at the top of it, it says China, glass, Queensware, but at the bottom it says auction and Negro sales.
Well, this picture on the left, Aaron, is just heartbreaking. Who's this poor young man?
Well, this picture that you're seeing on the left is Medgar Evers' wife. consoling her son at his father's funeral when Medgar Evers Sr. was killed.
Oh. And then you had juxtapose it with Coretta Scott King.
Yes, because what was ironic about this was 6 years later, after the assassination of Medgar Evers, Dr. King was assassinated. Mm-hmm. Let me correct myself, 5 years later.
5 years later, yeah. And again, Life magazine, recording our history.
Yes.
And here's another heartbreaking photo.
And when you see this, it says, Negroes in the city, the cry that will be heard. And we knew that even though the civil rights passage was in 65, like we stated earlier, legislation doesn't mean that just because it's passed, everything is going to go.
That's for sure.
So there was still a lot of work that had to be done. And you still had a lot of people that were saying, hey, we thought it was going to be this way, and it's still not this way. We're still dealing with the same situations that we're dealing with. So when Life magazine put this on the cover of March 8th, 1968, less than 4 weeks later, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
And you've got that right there, Life magazine again, week of shock.
Yes, yes. And it's really weird because I think about it, I'm too young to even know it. I wasn't even in existence. I was born June 30th of 68. Mm-hmm. So this was just before my birth. But I mean, it's like I said back and I say to myself, even with my mother being an African-American woman with kids, and I'm thinking of everything that she dealt with. And then I think about my wife's family. My wife, it was 12 of them in her family. Her mom and dad moved here from Mississippi, just to have a better chance in life. Mm-hmm. I mean, and like we said before, it always comes down to the vote. We sit back, Mark, and we think about African Americans have protested, will demonstrate, but now we have to get into the legislation. We have to get legislation passed in order to change some things that's happening in the world. And when the legislation is passed, doesn't mean that it's going to make a difference that day, but we have to work on making a difference.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on. Now, this was the Chicago Sun-Times on the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Yes, yes.
This is the headline. This is the front page.
Yes, sir.
And then you flip. Was this the back page or the flip side of the front page?
That's the back page.
The back page.
And what I did with this here is 2 pages, 2 newspapers. Nothing has ever been taken out of anything on the wall. Everything that you see is, if it's a magazine, it's the complete magazine, just not the cover. Oh, okay. And it was just weird to say that they put Martin Luther King slain, then they put the photo on the back side. Mm-hmm. And then it says murdered in Memphis.
Mm-hmm. And this is really precious too, because these you had to be there at the funeral service to be able to get your hands on one of these programs. This is his funeral service, the first one at the Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Yes.
And then you have a second one over here. I didn't even know there was a second service.
Yes,
but what's that one there?
Well, the second service, if you look at the original eulogy at where it says Ebenezer Baptist Church, that was at 10:30 at 2 o'clock because Dr. King attended and graduated Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, a black HBCU for all males. So Dr. King, they had a service for him at 2 o'clock that afternoon at Morehouse College. The original program from his funeral came from a lady named Bernita Bennett. She was an assistant to Coretta Scott King after Dr. King had passed. And this came up for sale in an auction house, and that's how I was able to get a copy of it. Mm-hmm. It's all authentic, so. Mm-hmm. And then, like you say, you had to be there to be able to get one.
Yeah, and then right below, what is this?
Well, what you're seeing is what is called the founding sponsor, and when they built the King Memorial in D.C., so many people were able to sponsor to getting it up off the ground and getting it built, and this is how they rewarded them. And I just happened to be on eBay one day, and I seen this come across on eBay.
Wow.
And I could not believe that it was on eBay. I was like, somebody's getting ready to give this up. This is a part of history. And I said to myself, why not bring this history here to Springfield? Why not bring it here? And like I said, as you walk around and you look at what's on the walls, I got stuff coming in, still waiting on it to get here. Mm-hmm. All my stuff coming from DC seems to be on hold. I said, but the one thing my wife Ann and I decided were that when the Lord calls us to greener pastures, all this that I have collected is going to go to the African American Museum in DC.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
In Springfield, I mean.
Like Springfield.
Yes.
So why not bring it to Springfield?
Why not bring it to
Absolutely.
Springfield?
Well, like he said, like Aaron said, some of these things have already been acquired, and because of the pandemic, he hasn't been able to get them delivered yet. But as you can see, there's some more wall space here, and I have a feeling it's going to fill up pretty quick. With another Illinois story in Springfield, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.